So good evening everyone, welcome to Bajirao Ias Academy mains answer analysis session. And in this session 2025 mains question papers and answers will be discussed. And you all knew that in our previous session also we have discussed some questions from general studies paper 2, and today also we have some more important question. So we'll be discussing the detailed answer for all these questions. So the first question is, India and Africa digital partnership is achieving mutual respect, co-development, long-term institutional partnerships. Elaborate. So here elaborate is the key word for this particular answer, right? So in this context, so first of all you have to introduce India and Africa digital partnership in the introduction specifically, and in general you can also talk about India and Africa relations. And apart from that, in the body part of the answer you have to describe how India and Africa digital partnership is achieving mutual respect, co-development and long-term institutional partnerships between India and the African continent. And in this answer it is always advisable that you need to write examples along with the points so that the answer will be more and more impactful. And ultimately in the conclusion, so you can also mention some challenges as well in the body part of the answer in India and Africa digital partnership, and you can also write some suggestions to overcome those challenges in the conclusion. Now in the introduction, as I've already suggested you that in the introduction you briefly introduce India and Africa digital partnership. So in the 21st century it is being marked by a digital revolution all across the world. So therefore in this context, digitalization has been playing a very important role when it comes to reshaping the existing societies, economies and governance throughout the world. And in fact this transformation has been fundamentally guiding India and Africa relations. So therefore in this context India and Africa have emerged as the natural partners, and they are actually bound by the histories of colonialism. And in fact India and Africa have the colonial past history, and in fact both these countries are aimed at achieving inclusive development and leveraging the digital technologies or digital transformation. And also remember, India and African countries are considered as the pillars of the South-South cooperation. So therefore this digital revolution in 21st century will fundamentally guide India and Africa relations. India-Africa digital partnership stands as a testament to their mutual respect. And in fact, as I have already told you that India and Africa have the colonial past, and each of these countries are also pillars of the South-South cooperation. So these countries have the shared interests, or they also have the common future. And in fact, they respect each other, which is known as the mutual respect. They understand their sovereignties, they understand the people and the problems that they have been facing. So therefore mutual respect is one of the foundational pillar of India and Africa partnership, and they are also committed for the mutual development of these two countries. And in fact they focus on number of other areas, for example technology transfer, capacity building of people, innovation and institutional cooperation. And if we define India's engagement with Africa, it is fundamentally driven by the capacity building of the African people and the institutions, right? So in the body part of the answer, what you have to write. So in fact India and Africa digital partnership, so how it is going to lead to the co-development, mutual respect, so all these dimensions which are already given in the question, so you just address those dimensions in the body part of the answer, and you should also mention appropriate examples along with those dimensions. Firstly, we need to talk about the foundation of the mutual respect between India and the African countries. Remember that India and African countries have the colonial past or common colonial legacy, and in fact they also have several developmental goals as well. Because as the countries which are developing in nature, we have a lot of goals to achieve. In fact our per capita incomes are very low, we have higher levels of poverty, and disproportionate number of people are still dependent on the agriculture sector. So therefore we have several developmental goals. Now in this context, so since we have a similar colonial past, similar challenges, there is a huge scope for the mutual respect of both India and the African continent, right? So in this context, we need to talk about the non-extractive approach as well. Now when I say non-extractive approach, when we invest in Africa or when we engage with the Africa, we not just focus on the resources, rather we focus on the empowerment of the people, capacity building of the people in Africa, and we also believe in the co-development and inclusive development of the people and the societies and the economies in Africa. So this approach of India is known as non-extractive approach, and this approach is also significantly different from the approaches followed by other countries like China, right? So we won't focus on extracting the resources, rather we focus on capacity building, local ownership of projects, and we will also avoid neo-colonial patterns as well. Now what are these neo-colonial patterns? So these are the patterns followed by the post-colonies, followed by some countries in the West, right? So they not directly colonized these countries, rather they follow the resource extraction, resource exploitation approach, which actually resembles the past colonies. Now in this context, let's understand the key areas of co-development between India and Africa. So firstly, digital infrastructure and connectivity is an area where India and Africa are engaging very closely, because India is helping build digital infrastructure in Africa. We all knew that last 1 decade India has achieved tremendous growth when it comes to the digital infrastructure. Now it is very important for the governance, education and commerce in African continent. So therefore India has been helping the African continent for developing digital infrastructure, because it is having a multifaceted benefits. And in fact, over 770 tele-education sessions and 1000 telemedicine consultations have been conducted so far, and the beneficiaries include countries like Ethiopia, Ghana, Nigeria and Rwanda. However, if we talk about the capacity building and digital literacy, this is also another area where India and Africa have been actively engaging and cooperating with each other. Remember, as I have already told you, capacity building is one of the main aim of the Indian government when it has been engaging with the African continent. So we have a non-extractive approach where we will not focus on extraction of the resources. So that will not be our sole goal. So therefore India's focus is on developing skills. So when you focus on capacity building of people, so first of all you have to focus on skill development, education and healthcare. So therefore India is primarily focused on skills transfer and digital capacity building among the people of Africa. Now one such example is E-Vidya Bharati and E-Arogya Bharati are two programs which were launched in the year 2019 by the government of India in Africa, so that to digitally skill and digitally build the capacities of the people of Africa. And then India has also been providing support in terms of startup and innovation as well. In fact, entrepreneurship is very important for a country like, for a continent like Africa with a huge population, demographic dividend, and there is a lot of consumer demand as well. So therefore, entrepreneurship ecosystem, and India is already achieved greater strides when it comes to the entrepreneurship ecosystem. So therefore, India has been training the African people and African entrepreneurs to develop the entrepreneurship ecosystem, right? So how India has been developing? India has been promoting mentorship, funding support, and also access to new and different platforms as well. Now one such example is India and Africa Growth Partnership Conclave, and in fact this Growth Partnership Conclave was conducted by the Confederation of Indian Industry and Exim Bank, and this has been promoting the collaboration between Indian startups as well as the African startups. Next area is e-governance and the fintech solutions. So we all knew that how India achieved rapid progress when it comes to the unified payment interface, right? So in this context, India's success with Aadhaar and unified payment interface, Digital India, so all these things have inspired the similar initiatives in Africa. Rwanda and Ghana, they have already adopted the digital ID systems which are modeled on Aadhaar. So we all knew that Aadhaar is one of the basic document, and in fact Aadhaar is also used for the biometric linkage to ensure that there will be no duplication and to weed out the ghost beneficiaries, so that the genuine beneficiaries will get the program's benefits. So therefore, in this context, Rwanda and Ghana have already adopted the digital ID systems. They are actually modeled or inspired from the Aadhaar, and in fact India achieved a rapid success or rapid strides in Aadhaar and UPI, and Digital India has inspired similar initiatives in Africa as well. Remember, we believe in co-development rather than the development alone. So therefore, when we are engaging with the African continent as a whole, we are also focusing on the development and capacity building of African people as well. And then we have to talk about the institutional partnerships and the diplomatic engagement that we have. Now, if we talk about the diplomatic engagement, we need to talk about the India-Africa Forum Summits. Now, in fact, the India-Africa Forum Summits have laid the foundation for a sustained institutional engagement between these two countries, or Africa as a continent. And in fact, the third India-Africa Forum Summit has emphasized on certain areas such as information and communication technology, education, health, and innovation. So these are the areas where the India-Africa Forum Summit has already emphasized on. Next, we need to talk about the developmental finance support. So it even emphasized on the developmental finance support. Now, in fact, over 11 billion in concessional lines of credit has already been provided to the different African countries. And in fact, India's Exim Bank has extended this 11 billion lines of credit to different African countries, and in fact most of this credit will be directed for the development of information and communication technology infrastructure. And then we should also talk about the collaboration with the African Union as a whole. In fact, India is a country which has supported African Union's membership into the 2023 G20 summit, where India was the president. Right. So therefore, in this context, India also supports Africa's Union's Growth Agenda 2063. And in fact, India also envisions a digitally empowered Africa, and there are several joint programs that India and Africa have launched together. And in fact, the joint programs especially focuses on capacity building, cybersecurity, and the digital governance. And in the conclusion of this particular answer, so you have to talk about India and Africa partnership, and in fact how this partnership is a solid model for the co-development, mutual respect, sustainable institutional cooperation. It is true that as a post-colonial countries have common colonial legacy with common challenges, so both these countries have a lot to exchange. So therefore, in this context, so by focusing on people's first digital transformation, and in fact India's overall objective is non-extractive approach, and India's focus is on capacity building in African continent. So therefore, India focusing on people's first digital transformation, it actually transcends the transactional aid models and fosters genuine knowledge sharing, capacity building, and long-term development in Africa. Right? So I hope you have understood this question, and in fact when you are asked such questions, it is always advised that you have to mention all these important dimensions, right? So along with these dimensions, you should also mention relevant examples as well. So next question is, with the waning of globalization post-Cold War, world is becoming a site of sovereign nationalism. Right? So we all knew that globalization. So globalization is traditionally or conventionally defined as a borderless world, or it is also defined as a global village where there is an significant exchange of ideas, goods, services, commerce, everything. So that is how globalization has been defined. And in fact, after the fall of Soviet Union, and in fact India is open for the globalization through the 1991 economic reforms, but before that also, with the rise of neoliberalism, globalization has also started spreading across the world. Now in this context, with the waning of globalization now, because most of the countries have been emphasizing on protectionism, for example US's America First policy, India's Atmanirbhar Bharat policy, so that actually indicates the rise of protectionist tendencies and waning of globalization, and post Cold War world is becoming a site of sovereign nationalism. So let's understand how the post Cold War world is becoming a site of sovereign nationalism. Now in the introduction, you just have to briefly introduce how post Cold War globalization promised integration and cooperation, but recent trends show a reversal. And in the introduction of this answer, so you have to mention examples of waning globalization, and then you need to mention how post Cold War world is becoming site of sovereign nationalism. And it is always advised that you have to divide this question into number of component parts, and you should also mention examples along with these component parts as well. Now in the conclusion of this answer, you need to talk about the sovereign nationalism and how it has been shaping the global geopolitics, and how it has been redefining the power dynamics and the international relations. So you have to write this in the conclusion of this answer. Now coming into the answer for this question, so as I've already told you, first of all, if you want, you can briefly define what exactly is globalization. And in fact, the globalization is a global village or a borderless world. Now globalization, which was peaked after the Cold War. Remember in the beginning I've told you that Cold War, which started increasing or which started spreading throughout the world after the Cold War, promised economic interdependence. So what does economic interdependence actually mean, right? So no country is self-sustainable, or no country can sustain itself, and in fact one country can depend on other country and many other countries as well for the goods and services, right? So globalization is actually the global economy or a global village where the borders are actually blurred. So therefore it actually promised the economic interdependence, the cultural exchange. Now you very often heard about the word westernization of Indian culture, and globalization is the reason for the westernization of Indian culture along with the colonial rule, and apart from that the global cooperation. So these are the fundamental pillars on which the globalization was essentially founded. However, in recent years what happening was, world was witnessing the retreat from the globalization, and there has been a resurgence of the sovereign nationalism as well, right? So there are several examples for that. For example, immigration into Europe and election of the right-wing leaders in countries like US, and in fact Atmanirbhar Bharat policies or COVID-19 pandemic, supply chain resilience, trade deficit. So all these are the major reasons for the growth of the sovereign nationalism and waning of globalization. For example, because of the globalization, so we have a huge trade deficit with China, right? So therefore there has been a retreat from the globalization and resurgence of sovereign nationalism as well. However, the states prioritize national interests, cultural identity, and the political autonomy over the global integration, particularly with the election of right-wing leaders in countries like US and Europe. So let's understand how sovereign nationalism in the post-Cold War context. If you talk about the sovereign nationalism which has been emerging in the post-Cold War context, so there has been, first of all, you need to define what exactly is a sovereign nationalism. And in fact, the sovereign nationalism emphasizes on nation state or importance of nation state in governance. And in fact, nation state as a concept has been emerged in the West after the Treaty of Westphalia. So therefore, nation state as a concept and its importance in the governance. So therefore, the primacy or the importance will be given to the nation state in the governance in sovereign nationalism. And in fact, not just governance, borders, economy, identity, so everything. So the primacy will be for the nation state. So therefore, it also resists the attempts for the global governance, global institutions, or any other external influence, which is known as sovereign nationalism. And in fact, so we all knew that after Second World War, the world was divided into two different blocks: the Western bloc led by US and the Eastern bloc led by USSR. And after the fall of USSR, USA has emerged as a sole superpower. And in fact, till from from the end of Second World War till the fall of Soviet Union, this period is known as the Cold War. So after the fall of Soviet Union, so this order is known as post-Cold War world order. Now let's understand what are the post-Cold War expectations. Now the fall of the Soviet Union in the year 1991, and it was marked by US-led unipolarity, because after the fall of Soviet Union, so US has emerged as a sole superpower, and in fact the world also experienced US liberalism and open markets after the neoliberal revolution that took place in the West, right? In fact, if you look at the today's reality, so today's reality is very clear that there are countries where there has been anti-globalization trends, and there has been trends of protectionism. So instead of world seeing a reassertion of national sovereignty, identity politics, and the authoritarian populism, so in fact they are rejecting the supranational governance, the global governance, and in fact the external interference. The reason being is the rise of identity politics, the rise of immigration, the rise of right-wing politicians in the West, and also the authoritarian populism. So all these factors have been rejecting the supranational governance. So let's understand the signs of waning globalization. So if we talk about the signs of waning globalization, so there has been a retreat from the free trade agreements. For example, when US had its president Donald Trump, countries are increasingly adopting the protectionist policies. For example, America First. So it is a protectionist policy adopted by US when Donald Trump was president. And apart from that, the trade wars and tariff wars. So all these are because of the protectionist tendencies that are being developed by right-wing politicians in the West. And for example, US withdrawal from the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which is also known as TPP, in the year 2017 is part of America First policy. Remember, I've already told you that America First is actually part of the protectionist policy that has been adopted by the US. And then we need to talk about the disruption to the global supply chains as well. So if we talk about the disruption to global supply chains, COVID-19 pandemic, so we all knew how COVID-19 pandemic led to the disruptions to the supply chain resilience of different countries, and that's when the countries started emphasizing on supply chain resilience. Or even India announced policy like Atmanirbhar Bharat, right? So Atmanirbhar Bharat, which is the self-reliant India. Atmanirbhar Bharat, which is the self-reliant India. So COVID-19 pandemic exposed the vulnerabilities of the global supply chains, and in fact there is also a shift towards reshoring or friend-shoring of manufacturing to reduce the dependence on the foreign suppliers as well. For example, US semiconductor policy that has been emphasizing on reshoring or friend-shoring of the manufacturing. So this is in line with the achieving supply chain resilience and also reducing our dependence on other countries. And in fact, US has also started the trade wars with countries like China, and the economic nationalism is also one of the defining characteristic of post-Cold War world order, because we have already experienced US and China trade war, right? So in fact, both of these countries have imposed tariffs and restrictions on each other's trade. So ultimately it has undermined the global trade norms and the global trade body like WTO. And in fact, countries like India have already increased tariff to protect the local industries, and India even exited from the regional comprehensive economic partnership, keeping in mind its trade interests, right? So therefore protectionism is coming into effect, and the globalization is waning over a period of time. Now let's understand about the rise of sovereign nationalism and political and cultural dimensions associated with this sovereign nationalism. And in fact, throughout the world there has been a rise of right-wing populist leaders, because the world has been facing number of problems such as illegal immigration, xenophobia, inflation, poor economic growth, declining per capita incomes. So all these problems and growing unemployment. So therefore there has been the growth of right-wing populist leaders who have been advocating for the protectionist measures against the globalization, right? So leaders have been protecting the nationalist rhetoric and anti-globalization agenda, and these leaders have gained a lot of popularity throughout the world. For example, Donald Trump, who belonged to USA, so he came up with the America First policy, and Prime Minister Narendra Modi of India, he advocating for Atmanirbhar Bharat or self-reliant India during the COVID-19 pandemic, and still we are guided by the principle of or the concept of Atmanirbhar Bharat. And in fact, Viktor Orban of Hungary, he has been emphasizing on illiberal democracy, not liberal democracy but illiberal democracy, and that's how the right-wing political parties usually work. And Jair Bolsonaro of Brazil, so he also adopted the anti-globalist stance in recent times to protect the domestic industries, right? So this is how the right-wing political parties and the political leaders are acting against the globalization, and they are preferring the protectionist measures. Now in this context, so there has been the weakening of the global institutions and multilateralism. So we have also seen the weakening of institutions like WTO and UN as well, because with respect to UN, United Nations Security Council, so there is no representation for countries like India and other countries in Africa and Latin America. So therefore when you don't have the representation, or when you deny the representation to a country with a largest population in the world, country with the largest democracy and fourth largest economy and third largest economy in terms of PPP, and in fact an economic power, a military power, so there's no meaning even if there is the existence of such institutions. So therefore institutions like UN have been losing their relevance, and institutions like WTO are being dominated by the Western countries, and the WHO also became largely inefficient handling COVID-19 pandemic, right? So therefore all these factors have been leading to the weakening of the global institutions and the multilateralism over a period of time, right? So therefore there has been a paralysis in the global governance as well, right? So when the bodies which were existed at the global level to achieve the objectives of the global governance, so they are becoming ineffective. So therefore there is a paralysis in the global governance as well, right? So in this context, the World Trade Organization dispute resolution mechanism, it has been crippled due to US blocking appointments, and climate change negotiations face non-cooperation from the major emitters as well, right? So there has been paralysis in the global governance. So let's understand the implications of this particular shift. So if we talk about the implications of this, so decline of the global cooperation, right? So because of all these protectionist tendencies and anti-globalization measures, weakening of the global institutions, and also the waning of the global governance, so all these factors over a period of time will lead to the global cooperation. So there are a number of areas where there is a need for the world to come together and work on these issues. For example, climate change, pandemics like COVID-19. So these are all several areas, right? So therefore the collective response to climate change, pandemics, terrorism are weakened in this context. For example, the failure of the countries to equitably distribute the COVID-19 vaccines under the COVAX program. Anyway, India through Vaccine Maitri program has distributed vaccines to a number of other countries as well, but we can say that there was a lack of equitable distribution of vaccines during the COVID-19 pandemic. So therefore decline of such global cooperation in the future will be an issue dealing with the terrorism, pandemics and climate change. Next, so there is also a risk of conflict and multipolar competition as well, because the return of Cold War like bloc politics, US versus China, Russia axis, Ukraine and Russia conflict, Taiwan Strait issue, because there are also issues between China and Taiwan. So all these factors have reflected a renewed geopolitical contestation as well. Now in the conclusion of this answer, what you have to write? So in the conclusion of this answer, you need to write certain things. For example, the post Cold War optimism, of a globalized liberal world order is waning, right? So it is clearly visible that the optimism that has been reflected after the Cold War, the liberal world or the globalized world, it is waning. So therefore it has been giving way to a resurgent wave of sovereign nationalism. And in fact, it is being driven by the economic insecurities among number of countries and the political populism because of the rise of right-wing political parties and the cultural assertion because of the immigration into countries like Europe, particularly illegal immigration, xenophobia, and the strategic competition between countries like India, China, Japan, South Korea, and US and European countries. So therefore, this trend reflects a deep reconfiguration of the global order. So that's how you can write the conclusion for this answer. And next question, it is a lengthy question, and this question is from Indian Polity and Constitution part. And in fact, so this is not new that UPSC has been asking such question. The question is, constitutional morality is the fulcrum which acts as an essential check upon the high functionaries and citizens alike. Now here the crux or core theme of this question is constitutional morality. Now, in the view of the above observation by the Supreme Court, so explain the concept of constitutional morality. You have to define what is constitutional morality and its application to ensure there is a proper balance between the judicial independence and judicial accountability in India. Now here, the constitutional morality is linked with the judicial independence and judicial accountability as well. And in fact, in a democracy, everything is limited by the constitution in our country. So therefore, judicial independence is very important to protect the constitution, constitutional values, and constitutional morality. Now, in a similar way, the judicial accountability is also a very important concept. So let's understand the model framework. So firstly, you have to define what exactly is the constitutional morality, the constitutional values. And in the body part of the answer, so what you have to write, so you need to prove the fact that constitutional morality is a fulcrum which acts as a check upon the high functionaries, whether individuals who are holding higher offices or the citizens. So it affects everybody, it checks everybody similarly, whether normal citizens or the people who are holding the higher offices. Now, this is the observation of the Supreme Court, and in this context, so it is important, it is true that the judiciary should have the judicial independence, and at the same time judiciary should also be accountable to the people as well, right? So how we can apply the constitutional morality to the judiciary's case so that judicial accountability can be ensured and the judicial independence can be maintained, right? So ultimately, in the conclusion of this answer, so the constitutional morality actually acts as a more moral compass. It upholds the integrity in Indian judiciary and the democratic institutions, right? So let's understand the introduction for this question. And if we talk about the introduction for this question, so the doctrine of constitutional morality refers to adherence to the core principles and values which are enshrined in the constitution, right? So in fact, the constitutional morality as a concept, right? So if we define this constitutional morality, so there are certain core principles and values of the Indian Constitution. So what are those core principles and values? For example, justice, liberty, equality, fraternity, rule of law, and democratic ethos, right? So all these things are being called as the core principles and values which are enshrined in the Indian Constitution. Now, in this context, the Supreme Court of India has invoked the concept to ensure that the constitutional functionaries, including judges, so they act not just legally but also ethically, and the spirit of the Constitution is also followed, right? So now in the body part of the answer, what you need to write, right? So let's understand the constitutional morality. And the constitutional morality as a concept nowhere mentioned in the Indian Constitution, but it was originally coined by Dr. B.R. Ambedkar, right? So constitutional morality was originally coined by Dr. B.R. Ambedkar. So it means certain core values, certain core principles, and the spirit of the constitution. It is not just about the text of the constitution. Rather, there are certain core principles and core values, and it is very important to uphold those core principles and values. Right? So in fact, it implies that the public officials, right, so those who are holding the higher offices, they must act in accordance with the constitutional values, the constitutional principles, right? So therefore, this is what the constitutional morality has been teaching us. Now, if we talk about the judicial recognition of the principle of the constitutional morality, Supreme Court in Navtej Singh Johar versus Union of India case 2018 defined constitutional morality. And in fact, so in this case, the Supreme Court has defined constitutional morality as a governing ideal that upholds the values of the constitution over the societal morality. And it has also invoked in cases like Sabarimala case in the year 2018 and Keshwanand Bharati case in the year 1973. So the objective is to protect the fundamental rights and the basic structure of the Indian constitution that has been enshrined, or that has been a judicial innovation by the Supreme Court in 1973 Keshwanand Bharati judgment. Sabarimala judgment is a very important judgment that has allowed women's entry into the Sabarimala temple in Kerala. Otherwise, the entry of women was prohibited into that temple. Right? So the issue of constitutional morality has been invoked by the Supreme Court in number of cases, Sabarimala case and even Keshwanand Bharati case. And in Navtej Singh Johar versus Union of India case, the Supreme Court has defined the constitutional morality as well. Now let's understand the element of judicial independence in India. Now, in fact, judicial independence is part of the basic structure doctrine that has been given by the Supreme Court in Keshwanand Bharati judgment. Right? So therefore, judicial independence is very important to safeguard the constitutional provisions and the rights of the citizens as well. Now let's understand the definition of the judicial independence. So judicial independence simply the autonomy of the judiciary from the executive and the legislative interference. There should not be any unreasonable interference and influence of the judiciary, influence of the executive and legislature on the judiciary. And this is very, very important for fair and impartial justice. Now, if we talk about the constitutional provisions that specifically deals with the judicial independence in India, Article 124 to Article 147 of the Indian Constitution that deals with the Supreme Court. Right? So Article 214 to 231 of the Indian Constitution deals with the high courts at the different states. So in fact, these provisions of the Supreme Court and High Court which are mentioned in the Indian Constitution, they provide for the security of tenure for the judges and also fixed service conditions for them, and also a protection against any arbitrary removal of the judges. Right? So these are the examples of the constitutional provisions which provide for the judicial independence. So let's understand the importance of the judicial independence. So the importance of judicial independence is to ensure checks and balances and uphold rule of law and even protection of the fundamental rights of citizens. So for all these reasons, to check the government, its arbitrary power, so judicial independence is very, very important aspect. So let's understand the judicial accountability and the need for the checks. Right? So judicial independence has been provided by the Indian Constitution, but along with that, there's a need for the judicial accountability as well. So therefore, there will be a check on the judiciary's unlimited powers. Now, in fact, judicial accountability actually means the judges of the Supreme Court and the judges of the High Court, so they should be answerable for their conduct and for their decisions taken. So therefore, there will be transparency and integrity in the functioning of the judiciary. However, there are certain concerns, right, with respect to the judiciary's functioning. For example, there are concerns about the judiciary's opacity and lack of transparency, and because of that reason, there has been increasing demands for bringing higher judiciary within the ambit of Right to Information Act. And in recent times, there is a delayed justice, allegations of misconduct by the judges, and lack of social representation. There's a huge vacancies, nepotism, and there is non-transparent appointments, because judges are being appointed by the judges, and this system is called as the collegium system. Right? So therefore, in this context, how can we apply the constitutional morality, balancing both judicial independence and judicial accountability? So firstly, we should ensure the ethical conduct by the judges. That is very important, right? So therefore, judges are expected to go beyond the legal technicalities, and they must act in line with the constitutional values so that they can uphold the constitutional morality as well. And in fact, judges are also not beyond the constitutional principles. In Veeraswamy versus Union of India case 1991, the Supreme Court held that corruption charges against the judges require presidential sanction. So therefore, balancing accountability with protection from the harassment of the judges, and also ensuring the judicial independence as well. And we all knew that in India, for higher judiciary, judges are being appointed by the judges, and this is known as the collegium system. And in fact, in India, collegium system is also criticized, and in fact there is a need for the reforming the collegium system, right? Because the functioning of the collegium system is very often opaque for the appointment of judges, and because of that reason it has faced criticism. However, the National Judicial Appointments Commission has been a constitutional amendment that was passed in the year 2014. However, the higher judiciary, the Supreme Court, struck down the National Judicial Appointments Commission as unconstitutional and invalid because it violates the independence of the judiciary, right? So the Supreme Court advocates on record Association versus Union of India case. So the Supreme Court struck down the 99th Constitutional Amendment Act, which is the National Judicial Appointments Commission, as unconstitutional. Now in this context, what should be the way forward? So if we talk about the way forward for this particular answer, there is a need to codify the legal standards, judicial standards, and the Accountability Act need to be brought in. And we all knew that the collegium system, which is making judges appointing the judges. So the proceedings of the collegium system should be more transparent, and there is a need for an independent body for the appointment of the judges. And there is also need to further encourage and enhance the judicial performance audits without compromising the independence of the judiciary. And apart from that, the internal ethical adherence is also very important in the higher judiciary, and that should be inspired by the constitutional morality. So you should also write the way forward, and in the conclusion of this particular answer, you have to emphasize on the importance or the significance of the constitutional morality. We all knew that this constitutional morality acts as an ethical compass, and that guides judges, citizens in a similar way. So therefore, in this context, ensuring that power is exercised in a responsible manner and justice is upheld in both letter and spirit as well. However, in India, there is a need for delicate balance between judicial independence and judicial accountability, and that can only be maintained when functionaries internalize and uphold the moral and constitutional values. And these moral and constitutional values are very important for the democratic fabric of our country. So that's all in this lecture, and thank you so much. And if you like this session, so please subscribe our YouTube channel and also like our video. So thank you so much.